What I'm going to do today is present you some results that we've obtained over the last about 10 years on the transformations of scholarly communication. Yeah, okay, so I'll just show you briefly the outline while everyone arrives. So in order to look at what has... Is that normal? Okay. Anyways, so before looking at the transformation that happened last 30 years with the digital age, we're going to look at the brief history of scholarly communication. So look at how journals have been created and how everything evolved from the 16th century to basically the beginning of the 20th century. Then I'm going to show you the results of 4 distinct studies that we've done. So digital age. Yes, I do. That's a very clever idea. So the keys, everything. I do have a little bit of screening here. Okay.
Belt, pointy objects.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah. Shoes. Yeah, so the results of 4 studies that we've made that basically look at how things have evolved over the last 100 years. And so when we think about the transformation in the digital age, these are things that have happened basically over the last 20 years. So there's not really a causal effect that we'll be observing. But given that we'll be observing trends over 100 years, we're going to see if things have happened in the 1990s, basically beginning or mid-1990s. So digital age and collaboration, digital age and concentration of scientific resources in terms of publication venues and citations. The age of scientific literature, so what did the digital age made on the age of what we cite? And then social media, which is something that I think we cannot avoid nowadays. Then if we have time, we're going to look at some other transformations. I don't think we will have time because I think I've I have too many slides, which is something that happens to me often. And then I'm going to end with a kind of a subversive proposal about what do we need journals for in the digital age. And so I guess I'm going to talk nonstop for 45 minutes, but if you guys have any questions or need some precision, don't hesitate to ask while I'm talking. Okay, so very briefly, so the diffusion of knowledge evolved from the antiquity, where we had treatises and monographs, but also mainly epistolary correspondence. So we had letters from researchers to others, and a very good case of that is Archimede to Eratosthenes. I don't know how to say that in English, actually. I only know it in Greek. Which actually the discovery is presented as a letter from one scientist to the other. And the correspondence stayed until the Middle Age and the Renaissance. So basically, the exchange of ideas was made through letters from one scientist to another. Then there were also copies, so pre-printing. We had people who were rewriting books. So given that it was pre-printing, those had to be handwritten in order to copy it from one researcher to another. And we've got a very interesting case of Da Vinci. We know that today we want to diffuse our research to the broadest public as possible, but Da Vinci actually never published his notebook. So it's a completely different way of seeing the diffusion of knowledge, which is, in this case, it's a non-diffusion of scientific knowledge. Then with the Renaissance, of course, the printing press accelerates the diffusion of monographs. But one element that is crucial is the creation of scientific societies, because it's the scientific societies who created most of the journals. So you had a few scientists who grouped together, they form a discipline, and then they create a journal which was essential to the diffusion of the results of their scientific ideas. And then this yielded to the emergence of small scientific communities. So one case very interesting in terms of the diffusion of letters was Father Marin Mersenne, who lived basically his scientific life in the 17th century, who was kind of a hub. So he was receiving letters from fellow scientists and then was transcribing them and sending it to as many scientists as possible. And so he was really a hub. He was kind of like the editor of a journal nowadays. So if we look at things more clearly, Mersenne is here, René Descartes is here, so there was an intense corresponding between the two of them, and then Mersenne would spread Descartes' ideas across Europe. So that's not limited to France. You've got plenty of Dutch, English, and French and German scientists at that time. So this is really how things were diffused pre-journal, pre-printing. Then, if we talk about the creation of scientific journals and of scientific societies, we cannot not talk about the Royal Society of London. Okay, so the Royal Society of London, it was created in the second half of the 17th century. It's quite interesting because they basically had weekly meetings to discuss scientific problems, and it's a pretty small community of about a few dozen participants. But what's even more interesting is how knowledge was being diffused. And so basically, you had a few dozen scientists in the room, and then they would do the experiments live. So you guys can all see how things are being made. And so peer review was made live as well through all of the other folks seeing the presentations and how actually the experiments were made. And Robert Hooke was actually the curator who was managing all of these experiments. In 1661, they published their first 2 monographs, and then the first scientific journal, the Philosophical Transactions, were created in 1665. And that's quite a lot of copies. For those of you who have written books, and I'm not talking about Cathy here because her books sell so much, but most of us who write books, especially in the French language, if you hit 400 copies, it's a bestseller. So in this case, at 1200, that was quite a lot of copies being printed. So now we forward to today, well, not today, but early 20th century. The scientific paper takes its current form basically at the beginning of the 20th century. It accelerated quite a lot the speed of diffusion of results. The thing is that despite the fact that the paper took its form in the early 20th centuries, there were still differences about how things were made then with today. So basically, peer-reviewed was not standard in Europe, while it became standard in North America. So there's a very interesting case that you guys might have heard of Einstein sending a paper to physical review. And physical review was already using peer review, but Einstein didn't really know what this was. And so he sends his paper to physical review and then receives corrections. And actually his paper got kind of not rejected, but major revision. What does Einstein do? He's a bit pissed. Because he writes the editor saying, I have submitted this paper to be published, not to be criticized. But then what does he do? The referee was actually right. And so does the correction and sends the paper to another journal. And so in the end, despite the fact that he was not very happy, he did the corrections. And also in terms of citation practices, how many authors or how many references per paper do you think Einstein was citing at that time? To give you an idea, today we basically cite about 40 references per paper. Einstein had basically an average of 2. And who were the authors that he was citing? Einstein, exactly. Only himself. So basically today the article takes several forms, but it's still the main medium for diffusing research, mainly in the natural and medical sciences, but more and more in the social sciences as well. So more and more scientific disciplines in the social sciences are now using the scientific article as their main media for diffusing research. And then, very quickly, that's the evolution of the number of periodicals that have been published since the creation of the Philosophical Transactions. So this is from Derek Price, 1963, a classic in the sociology of science. Basically, it shows that the number of journals has been growing exponentially. That being said, things cannot grow exponentially forever, because there would be one new journal published for every researcher that exists. And so at some point, we would reach a saturation. The thing is that this saturation limit kind of arrived at the moment where digital scientific information arrived. So it was easier and easier to create a scientific journal. It is nowadays much easier to create a scientific journal than it was in the 16th century. But we still today indeed have reached some kind of a saturation limit. Science doesn't grow as fast as it used to until the 1960s. And so why do we created that many journals? Well, creation of new subfields, an increased specialization of science, and also, of course, an increase in the number of scientists and engineers. So that's kind of the little background that I wanted to give. Then we arrive at the digital age. So typically, it's kind of a loose concept. But the early 1990s to the mid 1990s are typically considered as the beginning of the digital age. And what are the characteristics of digital scientific information? Well, it's easier to create, it's easier to update, it's easier to reuse, it's easier to access and to transmit. And there's a point that's crucial to understand, is the concept of rival versus non-rival goods. In the digital economy, if I sell you a journal, I still have it, because I sell you something that can be duplicated to the infinite. Whereas if I sell you a car, I don't have the car anymore, and so I need to buy rubber, I need to buy iron, I need to hire someone to build the car. So the marginal cost of scientific information in the digital age is close to zero, so it costs nothing to produce. And that's very important to understand when we're going to come to the costs of publication and the cost of the subscription by the major publishers. So as I said earlier, while for some of the results that I'll be presenting, there's kind of a causality that can be implied. Like for social media, of course, social media cannot exist without the digital age. For some others, it is less clear, like for collaboration. So we have more like circumstantial evidence of a relationship between the digital age and some publication patterns. Okay, so all of the results that I'm going to be presenting here are all based on the Web of Science data. Web of Science is a bibliographic database that indexes scientific papers as well as their metadata. So for each paper that's published in about 12,000 journals, we have all of their authors, we have all of their addresses, and we've got all of their references and citations. And so we're able to see what relationships exist between documents. We're able to see where research is being done and who contributes to that research and who collaborates with whom. And that's quite a big data set, actually. So it comprises about 50 million documents and about 1 million references. So we're really talking about, at least from my point of view, kind of big data. Okay, so the first analysis that I want to look at with you guys is the evolution of collaboration. So how did collaboration evolve over the course of the last century? And as the digital age had any effect on that? So do we see, starting in the 1990s, given that it's easier to collaborate with by sending preprints and by sending papers and by sending data, do we see an increase in collaboration? And then a sub-question to that is, what's the relationship? And how did the relationship evolve between collaboration and scientific impact? Because we have seen in other studies that the more authors you have on a paper, the higher the scientific impact. But was that the case in the early 20th century? Because all of the examples that we've got of top research from the early 20th century is all research that was done by single individual, not simple individuals. So how did that evolve over the last century? So we've got basically 3 indicators of collaboration. What's the number of authors? What's the number of institutions? And what's the number of countries? So those are kind of 3 layers of collaboration. So what do we see? Well, we broke down basically science into 2 broad categories. So this is the natural and medical sciences, and these are the social sciences and humanities. In both cases, from 1900 to basically 2010-11, we see a decrease of papers that are authored by only one author. We see an increase of papers authored by 2 authors, but then, starting in the mid-60s, it drops, because there's an increase of those that have 3 authors and more. So basically, you see some kind of an inflation of authorship, both in the natural sciences and in the social sciences, but more so in the natural sciences. We also see, if we look at the natural sciences, it doesn't seem like there is a big effect of the digital age. We don't see like flat lines and then 1990, a big increase in collaboration. So it suggests that, of course, the digital age maybe contributes to some of these trends, but the trends were already there before the advent of digital scientific information. So that's what we observe in terms of co-authorship. Then in terms of number of institutions, it's the same phenomenon, basically. So papers with only one address accounted for about 70%. So there were already collaboration. There was already collaboration in the 70s. In that case, actually, the data doesn't start in 1900 because Thomson, the company that creates the database, does not index addresses prior to 1972. So we're kind of stuck with only 40 years of data. So we see a decrease in the papers that have only one addresses, both in the natural sciences and in the social sciences and humanities. But we do see that, again, it is stronger in the natural sciences. And also some kind of an inflation. There are more and more and more and more and more addresses on papers. Basically, in the natural and medical sciences, the mode, so the number of addresses that happens on papers, the more often, I think it's 5 or 6. So we're in a mode of collaboration. But again, we don't really see a specific effect there of the 1990s. So it's kind of a long-term trend that we're seeing now. Then international collaboration. Well, papers with only one country are decreasing, but still single country papers account for about 2/3 of science. So we're always talking about internationalization of science. Of course, science is more and more international, but most of the research that is being done, even in the natural sciences, is mainly national. And why do we always see that like it's international? Well, it's because at the level of countries, things change. So at the level for Canadian papers, for instance, more than half of them are in international collaboration. But for the United States, it's about 20. So given that we're looking at global trends here, the percentages are way smaller. So the three countries that have the lowest international collaboration are the United States, China, and Japan. Why? Because they are big countries, so they don't necessarily need to collaborate to find the resources that they need in order to do research. On the other hand, you can expect Belgium and the Netherlands and Luxembourg to have very high international collaboration rates because they cannot sustain buying all of the equipment by themselves. Okay, so let's look at the effect of collaboration on scientific impact. That's based on most recent data. So basically you have the number of authors here and scientific impact. It's kind of a very clear relationship. The more authors you have, the higher the scientific impact. And this is not due to self-citations, because of course you could expect that the more authors you have on a paper, if each of them self-cite the paper at least once, then of course the impact duplicates by as many. And so, but this is observed without actually all of the self-citations. So you see that it kind of increases until about 20 to 30 authors, and then it becomes kind of flat. So there's no need for you guys to put 100 authors on your papers in order to gain a scientific impact. And we observe the same thing again at the level of the number of addresses and the number of countries. So the more authors, the higher the scientific impact. But how did that relationship evolve over time? Well, it's pretty obvious. Basically, these are papers with only one author. Already in 1900, one is basically the world average. So already in 1900, papers that had only one author had less impact. It was papers that had two authors. But then, papers with only two authors decrease because it's papers with three authors that take the place. So we see again an inflation. You need to add more and more and more authors to your papers in order to get a higher scientific impact. The way I'm phrasing that, it's as if it's purely cynical and that people add authors. That's not the reality. By adding authors, you typically add expertise, and in the end, it creates a better paper from a purely epistemic point of view. And so this, what peaks here basically are papers that have 21 authors or more. And that's the only category of number of authors that actually grows. But we could expect that this will reach a peak and then go down, and it will be papers that have 50 authors or more that will take that place maybe in 5 or 15 years. And again, this is observed in both natural sciences and social sciences and humanities. And so basically we see kind of the same phenomenon for a number of addresses. So you need to add more and more and more addresses in order to gain an impact. And also same in terms of countries. So that concludes the first part. So there's an increased collaboration. You need to add more and more addresses in order to gain an impact. But there's no clear effect of the digital age. Collaboration is a long-term phenomenon in science that has always existed. Digital scientific information, of course, helps, but it's not necessarily the main driving force. We don't see a breaking line, as we will see in other types of data. Okay, second group of studies, concentration of citations. We're talking a lot about concentration of resources since the 1% and the 99% groups that we've seen on Wall Street. Science is actually it's a meritocratic system where actually resources are typically concentrated. Historically, in the Canadian system, we would give a little bit of money to everyone. In the American system, we would have the opposite. We would concentrate resources into the hand of a few. At the Canadian system, we're actually seeing that we're mimicking the American a little bit and creating bigger and bigger and bigger grant, bigger Canada Research Chair, mega, ultra. What we've seen with the data, I won't present that in detail, but what we're seeing is that collectively, there's a loss. You should give a little bit to everyone rather than concentrating. Collectively, we would gain more from that. What we're going to be looking at here is how this concentration has evolved over time. So is the top 1% getting richer and richer, or no, we see some kind of a democratization of top papers? And so we're going to look at that indeed at the level of papers, at the level of journals, and at the level of country. I won't show the data, but it's basically the same trend as what we'll see. So very quickly, who thinks that there's an increasing concentration of resources in terms of citations and papers? It's a tough question, huh? Of course, I have the answer. So no one thinks that it's concentration, so everyone thinks that it's deconcentrating. Deconcentration, yeah? Okay. Well, you guys are pretty good. You guys have read the papers. So it's kind of the opposite from what we've seen in economic terms. So this is only contextual data. Data on citations and papers is highly skewed, and it's skewed in each of the disciplines. So this is individual level data. So we've disambiguated data for all of Quebec University professors. And basically what we see is that in terms of citations and publication, we have a 20-80 rule globally, where about 20% of researchers receive 80% of citations or publish 80% of the papers. But what's interesting is that citations are more skewed than papers. Of course, because citations are a subset of papers. You need to write papers first, and then you are cited. In the humanity, it's kind of completely crazy. About 2%, no, more, okay, about 10% of researchers account for 100% of the citations. So you've got 90% of researchers who are never cited. And in terms of funding, it's the same thing. So basically, about 20% of researchers account for 80% of all funding that's being received. Okay, so how does things evolve over time? There's a common law that comes back in science that papers are never cited. You guys have probably heard that one day. Well, you know, anyways, papers are never cited. It's not useful, etc. So what we've looked at here is the proportion of papers that have received at least one citation. So these are papers published in 1900. What proportion of them have received at least one citation 2 years after publication? So what we see basically is that the proportion of paper that is left uncited is decreasing everywhere. In medical sciences, in natural sciences, in social sciences, in social sciences, and not in the humanities. Though.
With or without self-citation?
Without self-citations, yeah. And then 5-year citation window. And so globally, that points to a deconcentration of citations.
Is this also controlled for increasing citations?
Yeah, exactly. So the only bad news is kind of for the humanities. So in the humanities, it's a flat line. After 5 years, you only have about 16% of papers that have received at least one citation. So the uncitedness rate is at about 84%. But that can be easily explained by the non-cumulative nature of the humanities. I wrote my master's thesis on the history of astrophysics in Canada. Who can cite me? Well, a future historian of astrophysics, but then time needs to pass in order that someone has some archival work to do and actually can write the story of the years that I've not covered. And so the thing is more on the long term than it is in the more cumulative disciplines of medicine and natural sciences. So papers are more and more cited. So science is deconcentrating. Something, a subject, it's a cumulative number of, let's say, funding or publications that can be associated with a researcher. And so here amount of funding, it's a pure 20/80 rule, okay? So what I'm showing here is what's the proportion of papers that is needed to account for 20, 50, or 80% of the citation. So how did that evolve over time? And this here we can see a strong effect of the 1990s. And so basically in 1990s in medicine, 25% of papers account for 85% of citations, so that's very close to the 20/80 rule. In 2004, it was 33. So we see that citations are spreading across a larger spectrum of papers. And so this is observed in medicine, in the natural sciences as well, in social sciences, not in the humanities. So basically, since the 1990s, science has been deconcentrating in terms of the citations that are received by paper in all fields, but humanities where basically it's kind of a very flat line. And we also see that it's very highly concentrated because there's a very high level of uncitedness. Okay, so what we looked at was at the level of papers. Now let's look at what's happening at the level of journals, okay? What we wanted to do here was to look at the relationship between between the number of citations received by papers and the impact factor of the journal in which the paper was published. The impact factor of a journal is basically a retrospective measure of the number of citations that are received by papers. So here we're kind of looking at the reputation of a journal versus the proportion of top paper that it publishes. And what we see, and that's again it's very strongly linked with the digital age. Since 1990s, the relationship between the reputation of a journal and its capacity to attract top papers has been steadily decreasing here. So another way to put it, and that's what the next slide does, the proportion of top papers that are published outside top journals is decreasing. So there's more and more top research that is not published in Science, that is not published in Nature, that is not published in the proceeding of the National Academy of Sciences of the US. So there's a diversification of these top papers. Why? Because there's more and more journals that have been created, mainly because of the digital age. And so this is what we see here at the more specifically. In 1990s, basically PNAS, that was pretty high actually. PNAS was publishing about 9% of all top cited papers. So they published 9% of the top 1%. And in 2010, it's down to 2.7, 2.8. So the same thing is happening to Nature, to Science, to the New England Journal of Medicine, to Cell, to Lancet. So they are all losing their market shares of top cited papers. And who do you think is taking those market shares? What journals? It's a blend of two groups of journals, basically. You've got disciplinary journals, mainly in nanotechnology. So it's very interesting that researchers in nanotechnology, they don't seem to aim at those top journals. They want to publish their top discoveries in their disciplinary journals, which is not an habit that is very common But also one journal is taking a very high proportion of that, and it's +1. Why? Because +1 publishes about 50,000 papers a year. And so, of course, the odds are that it's going to get some top papers from these otherwise, these top, historically top journals. And also, the policy of Nature, which was to diversify kind of the trademark of Nature by creating some kind of small journals on the side, is gathering some of the market shares of the top journal. And so basically, small journals, new journals are taking their fair share of top papers, and these otherwise historically known as top journals are decreasing, and they're getting less and less of these top papers. So again, this points to a diversification and a deconcentration of scientific activities, both at the level of papers and also at the level of journals.
One is not a deconcentration, it's an over.
Yeah, exactly. But it's getting the share of these otherwise. It's an interesting case that we can probably discuss more in details in the discussion. I'm an editor of +1, but I'm not too much embedded into +1. But there's good sides to +1. A few good sides. And so what we've been observing here at the level of papers and at the level of journals is also observed at the level of countries. And so basically, science used to be concentrated in a few countries. Then with with China, that's increasing exponentially. Same with India. Same with South Korea. We really see a geographic geographic deconcentration of scientific activities. And even within the countries, if you take China, for instance, science is not concentrated in Shanghai. It's, again, spreading everywhere in China. Okay, the age of scientific document now. Okay, so we typically always have the idea that the useful life of things is getting shorter and shorter. And so the hypothesis here is, do we observe that in science as well? And so is the impact of, did the electronic means of diffusing knowledge, given that it gives faster access to new literature, makes us citing more recent documents? So on average, do we cite more recent stuff over time, or we cite older stuff? So that anyways, the knowledge that is contained in scientific papers is not eternal. It has some kind of a time validity. It can be outdated. And sometimes you just stop citing something because it becomes obvious. No one cites Einstein anyways, which is fine because he didn't cite anyone. But no one cites Einstein except historians because it's taken for granted. It's obvious. And so this is the typical citation curve of papers. And so basically, this is publication year 0. Then for the first 2 or 3 years, your number of citations increases. And then it falls relatively fast, depending on the discipline. So in medical sciences, it falls very fast. In the humanities, it takes a little bit longer to go down. But typically, after 2 or 3 years, you've reached a peak, and then you go down. Now, how did the peak evolve? So do we today cite more younger stuff, or globally we cite older stuff? And this one, well, you guys might know it. It's kind of a little bit surprising. Over time, we cite older and older stuff. So the digital age didn't really have an effect of us focusing on more narrow and more recent scholarship. Actually, these are long-term trends. And so why do we see 2 big hills here? Those are the 2 world wars. What happened during the 2 world wars? Several things. But one thing is that people published less. There was less research being done. And so those who did research, the literature that they could cite was getting older because less recent literature was being published. Follow me on that? And so the 2 effects that we observe here it's kind of the same thing here, because it's between 1975 and basically 1970, science was growing exponentially. And so each year, you had more research being published than the year before, and it was growing exponentially. Since basically late 80s, beginning of the late 70s, beginning of the 80s, the curve of scientific growth kind of reached a more linear type of growth. And in a linear growth of science, you cannot cite younger and younger stuff because the documents that exist are getting older and older. And so this is mainly a mathematical explanation. Basically, in a system where knowledge production has an exponential growth, the age of scientific material, the age of cited material decreases. Thus, if the rate of growth changes from exponential to linear, or if there's a decrease in scientific production, the age of cited material should decrease. It's purely mathematical. Basically, researchers are citing papers that exist. If the existing pool of paper is getting older and older on average, the age of scientific references will get older as well. And this has been confirmed also by other works in sociology of science. There's been few scientific revolutions since the golden 30 years of the 30 years after the Second World War. And since 1975, we would be in kind of a period of normal science. That's why some researchers in physics are actually thinking that we should look for extraterrestrial intelligence in order to help us gain more science. And they are actually serious. Okay, and that's the last thing that I want to look with you guys. It's basically the use of social media in scholarly communication. That's a clear effect of the digital world in which we are. We're going to look more specifically at Twitter. And Twitter is basically the social media that's being the most used with Facebook. But the thing with Facebook is that the data is very difficult to gather. Twitter is much more public. And so basically, Twitter has reached about 230 million active users, and there's about 500 million tweets a day, which is pretty high. Almost 40% increase of users in the last year, well, actually the year before. That being said, if we say that about 16% of US citizens have an account or are active, the uptake by researchers is much smaller. And so basically, researchers are not really on Twitter. There's only a small proportion of researchers who are using it for work. In some specialties, though, like the digital humanities, a very high proportion of researchers are indeed on that social media. The thing is that Twitter right now is being increasingly used as some kind of a metric for scientific impact - social impact. But no one really knows what it measures, and no one really knows what are the characteristics of the data that is actually counted here. And so some say that it measures scientific impact, and that it can actually predict scientific impact because tweets are available from the minute the paper is being published. Some say that it's social impact. It's diffusion of science by the public or to the public. Some say, and I'm part of them, that it's a total buzz. The problem is that these indicators are increasingly promoted by publishers and also increasingly used for research evaluation in Europe and in the United States, despite the fact that no one really knows what is being counted here. And so the typical use by publisher, if we look at the small journal that you guys might have heard of, it's called Nature. You've got article metrics here, and when you click on that, you get typical citation rates, but also online attention. So basically, how many tweeters, or how many tweets did the paper had? How many links on Facebook? How many Google Plus? You see that no one really uses Google Plus. Some news outlets, Reddit, blogs, etc. So both for-profit publishers like Nature are using it, but also PLOS. Actually very fun on those metrics, to which they add views, citations, and downloads, and also on what platforms were saved, cumulative numbers of downloads, etc. So those are all metrics that are very fun to look at, but no one really knows what is measured by that. So
what's coming next? Likes?
Likes is already there, I think.
It's already there.
Yeah, if you look at that here, yeah. So Facebook page are basically likes on Facebooks. But that's an underestimation because it's only for those who have public Facebook accounts. So that's why they are not really using, considering Facebook seriously now. And so with some of the members of my team, like Stephanie, who are here, we're trying to understand what is actually being measured here by looking at what types of research gets tweeted. And so here we have the list of the most tweeted documents. Those were published in 2011, and we wanted to look at, did those documents add some kind of a scientific impact? So here you've got the number of citations that the paper received, and here you've got the number of tweets. Those two papers are actually linked with the Fukushima catastrophe, and they were mainly tweeted by Japanese people who said, well, I was close to Fukushima, and everyone is having cancer now, and so they kind of relate to that. This one here is about the Google effect on memory. This one here, it's pretty interesting because it has 0 citation. Why did it get tweeted? For 2 reasons. The paper was authored by 2 high school students, so it was some kind of unusual. But also they call that some kind of a zombie reaction, because the reaction is something, it's a reaction that starts and then stops for 10 hours and then restarts again as if nothing had happened. So they call that a zombie, a zombie chemical reaction, and then you tweet that because it's funny. This one here also has no citation. What's the topic? Acne flares. Who tweeted that? Well, mainly teenagers who say, well, you should not eat whey protein because it gives you acne. And then, okay, so I will not look at them all because there are some of them that are very funny. And I don't want you guys to laugh too much. But we see that so while it's very, the interesting thing is that it's very heterogeneous. Some papers are going to get tweeted because there's a high scientific content to them, like this one on physical activity and mortality rate. And some others are going to get tweeted because the title is catchy, there's something funny to the paper, etc. Looking at that, we've talked about Einstein earlier. I don't think that the papers on the 1905 or the 1911 paper on general relativity would have been tweeted so much, because about 10 people on the whole world could understand them when they got published.
And not right away.
And not right away, exactly. And so, so it kind of measures some kind of, it's very heterogeneous, but we need to understand these metrics better before using them in any kind of evaluation. And very quickly, this shows that there's almost no correlation between citations and tweets. And so these are all papers published in the general biomedical research category. Number of tweets here, numbers of citations. We added one in order to take into account papers that had 0 citations. And it's a very low correlation. So it means that the two indexes are measures of 2 different things. I think that there's only one thing that cannot be, that we cannot live without in the current scientific system. So journals are for diffusing research results. Well, we can do that without journals. We can post papers online. We don't really need a journal to do that. Establish the priority of findings. Well, we can do that again by putting a preprint online. Providing with the recipe and allow for reproducibility, same thing. Peer review can be done afterwards. We're all authors and we're all reviewers, so we can all actually assess the content of the papers that we are reading. The thing that journals are providing now, especially in the kind of the research evaluation culture in which we are at now, is provide with a hierarchy of discoveries. And so this discovery was published in Nature, so it should be better than the discovery that got published in the Canadian Journal of Chemistry. And so by ranking the discoveries, it kind of ranks author, institutions, and countries, and departments, etc., etc. And so it's all linked with scientific capital, and the way our current university presidents are looking at university rankings, unfortunately, this is probably here to stay. And so I'm going to stop now and leave you guys time for questions.